VenomousStare back after a long break with another IdrA video, because quite frankly, it doesn't get any better than Greg IdrA Fields. These are very old games. This is a part of my Venomous Classic series where I take a look back at the old games of StarCraft 2 that I find historically relevant or highly entertaining, and basically they're just the games that I think are worth revisiting. So spawning in the top left here, Greg IdrA Fields, the American macro Zerg, nicknamed the Kraken, the macro machine. This guy was essentially the best non-Korean right at the end of the Brood War era, and he was a top-tier foreigner who could even compete with the very best Koreans at the very beginning of the game's life cycle for at least a year before he actually started to wane a little bit, although he was damn good throughout his entire career. And IdrA, if you don't know, is my favorite pro gamer, and of course he is known for his macro play style, a very methodical approach where he would just grind you down with better mechanics, not missing overlords, hitting his injects, spreading creep, you name it. When it came to macro, this guy had it. So his opponent, playing under the ID OGS-SKS, is actually a guy named Tester, and Tester did this thing that I hate that pro gamers do, which is changing their IDs. There's a handful of pro gamers out there that sort of change their ID like a Facebook status, and that is really obnoxious, really terrible, and quite honestly it makes it hard to keep up with and follow their career. But his ID doesn't really have any impact on his playstyle. What you need to know about Tester, aka Trickster, he's going to be called Tester for the rest of the cast, is that he is just a solid macro Protoss who is capable of cheesing, but was also capable of playing solid macro games. I think these are the hardest Protoss players to deal with. Now it could be argued the insanely cheesy ones are sort of more annoying to play against or more difficult to deal with, but the player who can play both styles and is versatile, I feel is the most difficult to deal with personally. So Tester is Korean, and this is the Day 9 King of the Beta tournament. And let me just mention right out the gate that these VODs are going to be in the description. This isn't an attempt to pirate or undercut anyone, although I think anyone with a brain realizes that, because these games are really, really old. No one is seeking these out or going to watch them. If you go look at the comments on the original video, no one has commented in like 7 years, so this is something that I wanted to do because I really like IdrA and I really like StarCraft 2, and I feel as though going back and revisiting these old games is really interesting and fun. So just make sure you check out the original. It will be in the description. So moving on into the game, we see Tester here is open with a 2-gate rush. Now I know I mentioned earlier that this is part of the Day 9 King of the Beta tournament, and you might be saying, the beta, huh? When was that? Because we're all the way in 2018. The beta for Wings of Liberty was mid and early 2010. Yes, 2010. Like 8 years ago. I was in high school. I could barely drive at the time. So these are old games. This is even before I started playing. And if you look at the Wings of Liberty beta, it is absolutely insane. And a big focus of these casts is going to be sort of reflecting on how crazy the Wings of Liberty beta was, and almost saying like, oh wow, I can't believe we've come this far. Look at how it used to be. Look at all this crazy stuff. Of course I will be casting the games and talking about the players, but this is so drastically different that it would be wrong of me to sit here and cast as though it was Legacy of the Void, because if you didn't know any better, or if you didn't play back in Wings of Liberty, you might be asking yourself several questions like, I mean, I could pretty much go on and on and on, but the entire metagame was different, and right now we see that the Protoss player Tester is moving out, and unfortunately for him, he left his wall in open. Now, he was pressing out, and it looks like IdrA's going to get some probes here. He doesn't have enough lings to completely kill everything, and Tester's going to be retreating, but he does have enough lings to do some damage. So essentially we see Tester doing a 4-gate rush with +1. This was essentially the very first rush build that was ever figured out. It's straight up 4-gate. Now this really fell out of favor for a lot of different reasons. The research time on warp gate used to be something absurdly short. I want to say it was like less than half of what it ends up being in current day StarCraft, but you used to be able to get warp gate super quick. You could dump all of your chrono boost into it and just get it incredibly quickly. And we saw that Tester elected to go for +1. Now, straight up 4-gate, a very simple build to execute. Oftentimes it's what you see beginners try to do, especially back in the day, because it's very simple. You stay on one base, you get 4 gates, you get warp gate, and you're gravy. Now IdrA was very intelligent. He built up a ling count that didn't completely cut his drone count, but then he was able to run around and completely scout out Tester and get perpetual map vision. And as soon as Tester walked out, IdrA hit this tiny little window of 10 seconds where he ran in and got probes and delayed the push. So these are +1 zealots. They 2-shot zerglings. That's incredibly powerful. Back in Wings of Liberty, pylons would warp in 4 seconds everywhere. You didn't need a gateway attached to them, and also they could warp in on high ground. It was really crazy. But essentially Tester is going for a rush play. He knows that IdrA is going to try to run in and snipe his pylon as soon as he attacks, but he also wants to get this force field down on the ramp. So there it goes, IdrA trying to stop the reinforcements, 4 spine crawlers. He got out Hydras just in time, and he's actually going to surround with the Lings because I don't think he thought that he could kill everything with all the sentries and OGS, SKS, aka Tester GGs. So I'm going to rewind it a little bit. So basically what happens here is the Protoss player is looking to run up and get a force field off on the ramp. There are no Ravagers. This is one of the most devastating micro tricks a Protoss player could do against a Zerg, because essentially, obviously, Zerg needs to have their hatcheries be able to produce units, and then the units rally out to defend. And if they only have 2 hatcheries because you're one base all inning and you force fill the ramp, then obviously that means half of their units can't escape or get to the fight. So IdrA did an incredible job of scouting, saw that it was a 4-gate, got spines down, teched into Hydra just in time. Roaches back in this day were pretty damn bad. I know at one point in the beta Roaches were 1 supply, but they had been nerfed by this time, I'm almost certain, and they had like 3 range or something absurdly short. They were really terrible. So we saw IdrA tech up into Hydras, which, if you don't know, back in the day especially, Hydra Ling was the go-to composition if you knew your opponent was doing warp gate based aggression, and as a Protoss player you really tried to tech up into Colossus. So we're going to go to the next game. So one of the most defining factors of the early days of StarCraft was the map pool, especially in the Wings of Liberty beta. In this time period, we saw a slew of what would be considered rush maps, and these maps were exceptionally small. This map, Steppes of War, is pretty much the smallest map ever played in competitive StarCraft 2. Zerg is extremely, extremely bad on this map. Against Terran especially, but against Protoss as well. Basically, it's bad because Zerg, as a race, wants to make as many drones as possible and not have to be forced to make units, because if Zerg just aimlessly makes attacking units, they don't make drones, so they fall behind. That's just sort of bread and butter StarCraft 101. Well, on this map, it was so damn small and the rush distance was so short that even if you had a Ling at the front of their base, you could be attacked and the units could reach your base, your natural, before you could even get Lings out. So it's just very, very small, very hard for Zerg. And another thing that's worth noting, as we see Tester opening for a forage here, in StarCraft, you have to remember that now we always see neutral depots or neutral rocks at the bases of ramps, because back in the day this devastating thing would happen to Zerg players where they could essentially get walled in at the bottom of the ramp, and we see this occurring here. And especially back in the Wings of Liberty beta, you could just, and like even into the early days of Wings, you could wall people in with 2 pylons. So essentially this would happen very frequently to Zerg. They'd get walled in with 2 pylons, you put a cannon behind the pylon, Zerg can expand. Now, you might be thinking, well, actually there's a lot of ways to deal with this. Well, let's just talk about how Zerg can deal with this. They can go for a Nidus, which the thing about a Nidus is Protoss knows that you're going to try a Nidus. You only have a handful of options. So all Protoss has to do is keep an eye on the corner of their bases. Nidus was super expensive. You had to tech up to layer, and it's like 200 gas, and then gas for the Nidus worm, which off of one base is like almost impossible, especially because you're probably going to be going roaches if you're going for, or you want to have roaches if you're going to Nidus, but roaches cost gas. So that's pretty terrible, because when the Nidus spawns, or when it's building, excuse me, you can kill it, and it's like 200 HP, and it looks like IdrA's going to make another hatch in his main here, so he's probably going to try to Baneling bust out and run across the map, hope that his opponent does not have any defenses or leaves his wall open by accident again, perhaps. And IdrA made a little wall in with the Zerglings there on hold position, but Tester mineral trick through, so basically that just means you right click on the minerals and the probe can get to the destined location without really worrying about units, because it can slide right through. This is something that still works, by the way, and oftentimes how players get cannon rushes off. So Tester's way ahead. Not only does he have a forge with +1 starting, his cyber core just finished, and he's getting a zealot. He also has a cannon at home. So this is going to be rough going for IdrA, and most importantly, Tester saw another hatch, so he pretty much knows that IdrA's just going to try to mass a bunch of units and bust out. And because what's funny about Steps of War is, despite the fact it's insanely small, the main is freaking huge. So it takes Zerg an absolute dick year to get creep spread out to the ramp, meaning that busting out with spine crawlers really isn't that strong or good of an option. And we can see here Tester has the money for an expansion, and if he really wanted to, he could throw it up at any moment. Tester's going to be playing very cautiously though after seeing the 2 hatches. The rule of thumb for StarCraft, as we see the expansion for TOS go down, is that Zerg wants to be a base ahead, and at this point Tester's going to be a base ahead very soon. All he has to do is hold. It's very simple. If he holds, he wins. IdrA is completely all in. He has next to no drones. He's banked up enough gas to do a Baneling bust, and he's mining pure minerals so he can double pump Lings. So for Tester, pretty much what he wants to do is just get a very nice wall in. He's putting up another gateway. He has a sentry. Notice he's backing up that pylon, probably with a pylon or a cannon. Now IdrA's going to run up here with Banelings, and if Tester hits his force fields, there's no way IdrA should win. Because if you've noticed, there's no naked pylons here. There's no structure that can be killed with 8 Banes. 8 Banes doesn't kill a cyber core, a gateway, or a forge. And the Banes are, oh, nice force field there, as you saw the shift A move command, and very nice there by Tester to let his zealot get hit just a little bit and then force field. And at this point IdrA's dead. There are more sentries on the way. The wall in is hard. There's no way to break it down. There's no follow up. He doesn't have a lair. He has less workers. He has less bases. IdrA was just almost immediately killed off by this cheesy cannon rush we saw here. And IdrA GG's, so let's move on to the next game. Now IdrA sort of gets a lot of flack for being a guy that can leave games early. Let's be clear, that was not an early leave. He was playing on one of the worst Zerg maps ever created. He had less workers, less tech, less bases. He was dead. And for IdrA, that was the sort of loss that I would say really got under his skin and bothered him. And if you know IdrA, you know that he's a grinder, a guy that plays an incredible amount of games. And I know the quality isn't great on these videos. They are from 2010. IdrA, of course, known as a guy who always said what was on his mind. He was very honest, very witty, and pretty goddamn funny. And that game was the sort of game that would inspire him to say such quotables as StarCraft 2's a fucking joke, because there's really nothing Zerg could do there. And it's universally agreed upon that the neutral depot or neutral rock at the base of a ramp is needed, and even though it took Blizzard about a year longer than it should have to figure that one out, yeah, it's the neutral rock in the neutral depot is huge, because obviously Zerg has to be able to fast expand. And even like in that game, for instance, it's not like IdrA went hatchery first and got cannon rushed and lost, and I'm just being Zerg biased. No, 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 no. IdrA opened gas pool, like he was going for a speedling expand. He got a very quick pool, which again we see him doing this game, going for speedling expand. This is a safe build. He's not being greedy. He's not trying to super quick expo. No, no, no. He's being safe. This is one of the safest builds that Zerg can do, is this speedling expand build. And despite that, IdrA didn't even have a chance to break the cannon rush. I don't even think he could have spawned a Zergling before he was walled in. So that really limits what you could do with Zerg. We spoke about the limitations last game and the builds you could do. Dropper Lords weren't from Evo Chamber, they weren't from Lair. You had to not only get Lair, but research an upgrade that was 200-200, in addition to Overlord Speed, which was 100-100, and considering they both research from the Lair, yeah, that would have taken forever, as we see the Scouting Probe get killed there. And that was another problem for Zerg. If they got rushed, not only were the choices limited, but very oftentimes it was like, well, okay, I can try to go for drops, but I'm going to be moving out at like 7 minutes off of one base. Like my opponent's going to have 2 full bases fully saturated, so I just have to go for a low eco all in, which is what we saw IdrA do. And because the Protoss player scouted it and was able to get a hard wall in up, as well as a sentry, IdrA didn't have a chance. Again, there's no Ravager. Now you get cannon rushed and it's like, well, I just make a Roach Warren and make some Ravagers and clear it. No, no, no. In this, way, way harder. So Tester's going to open with 2-gate pressure again, and he's going to take an expansion behind it. He's not going to go for this aggressive 4 warp gate attack. Now in game 1 we saw 2-gate pressure with +1 zealots, and of course, if you don't know, in StarCraft upgrades are always important, but there are certain specific unit interaction upgrades that are more important than others, as we see a big swell of Lings here for IdrA. And he's going to attack the gates as he was massing up Lings all in the early game. Here comes a fight between the Zealots and the Lings. Thankfully for Tester, he was able to get those Zealots up against a wall, so IdrA's not actually going to get as inefficient of a trade as he wanted. But it was very smart and astute of Tester to do a full wall off here, because IdrA knows that Tester likes to opt for this 2-gate pressure. Of course, it's worth pointing out that in Brood War this was extraordinarily popular in this matchup, and because StarCraft 2 had just come out, a lot of the builds that we saw were sort of like Brood War copycat builds, where people were just trying to do the same stuff they did in Brood War in StarCraft 2. 2-gate pressure is a great example of this. Now, about a year into the game's life, people realized that Forge Expand was way, way better. This was before the days of the Mothership Core and the Shield Battery, of course. People also started doing some Nexus first, but this is back in the day. 2-gate pressure was very strong, the maps were smaller, it was much easier to pressure Zerg, and it was also way harder to scout. The Overlord was significantly slower than it was in 2012, and the Overlord speed upgrade was hidden behind lair tech. It's also worth pointing out that the Queen was absolutely terrible back in this time. The air range was like 6 instead of 9, I want to say, and way more importantly, and I mean way more importantly, the ground range was an abysmal 3. Look, the Queen basically has to walk up and French kiss those Zealots and get her little talons out and try to, even right now the Queen can't attack. You have to really be right on top of stuff. This meant that Queens were way worse at defending 2-gate pressure, bunker rushes, Hellions, all sorts of stuff. Oh, and back in this time, you had to actually research hallucinate. There was a period in time where Protoss players, like where it became free and it became sort of standard for Protoss to open with a lot of sentries and just scout by hallucinating a Phoenix and shift clicking it around the Zerg base. And I always thought that was a really underrated strategy because it was a great way to scout and it was very, very difficult to deny. It's a lot easier to deny an observer than it is to deny a hallucinated Phoenix, because that sucker's gonna speed into your base and just see what you're doing. And it really wasn't ever standard to research hallucinate. Of course, one of the most popular games of all time was when Huck played against IdrA, one of the best rivalries the game has ever seen, and Huck researched hallucinate, although it wasn't really an opener as much as it was a late game strat type thing. And he hallucinated a bunch of void rays, which hallucinated units don't do damage, and IdrA thought he was massing them up all game. And as his army was getting obliterated after a long macro game in which it looked like IdrA was going to win multiple times and couldn't quite finish Huck, IdrA saw the void rays, thought they were reeling left. And even if you've only seen a handful of StarCraft games, you've probably heard of that one. Very, very popular, as was taking this base. So this map is Scrap Station. It's sort of a horseshoe shape. This one actually wasn't very bad for Zerg. It was sort of hard against Terran, because Terran could do these parade pushes through the middle of the map. There's this bizarre little bridge that sort of connects the two naturals, but it's blocked by two rocks. And Zerg really didn't like to open with any sort of ranged units. I mean, like I said, roaches were pretty bad. As you see, sentries getting caught, and they'll throw up a few force fields and try to escape. The ones by the gateways will fall back to the cannon. And look at that. IdrA is actually going to lose pretty much all of his lings, so despite the fact that Tester got caught out, that was some nice recovery micro. And it was very popular to take the third base at that gold for Zerg, as you see a Spire up here for IdrA, as well as great, great drone production. Back in the day, it didn't show you how many workers you had at the base, so obviously pro gamers knew what great saturation was, but if you were a new player, it was really hard to figure out how many workers per base you needed, because I don't know how long I looked for the information of, yeah, it's actually 16 workers is the optimal saturation on each base. And then you could obviously figure out that it was 3 guys on gas pretty quick, but if you were a newbie and you were Zerg, a lot of times the thirds were hard to take in the early days, so you were sort of sitting here like, when do I stop making drones? And that's sort of the question that you're always asking yourself as Zerg, regardless of when the time period was. But no worker counts here. That's probably one of my favorite things Blizzard has ever done, is add that little worker count bar above all of your bases that says, 16 out of 16 workers. And then if you get more, it says like 20 out of 16 in red. Great, great maneuver by Blizzard for new players to do that. So as I was saying earlier, that gold base in bottom left is popular because that... Okay. The third base is so popular because the third base directly south of where Tester's attacking is pretty shitty and hard to defend as Zerg. And obviously gold base is better than normal base. So Mutiling Baneling coming forward here, minus the Baneling. This is just straight Mutiling. You really didn't see many Banes against Toss because Zerg didn't have as many gases to go off of, and Banes just aren't really that good against Toss in general. And Tester is doing a great job with Blink Stalkers here. This is another play that you saw more frequently back in the day, as we see IdrA fighting pure Muta into Stalker. This isn't ever really a great decision because Mutas are harassment units. They're not that good in a straight up engagement, and until Heart of the Swarm, Mutas didn't have a passive where they regenerated health very quickly. And we can see a lot of IdrA's overlords got caught out in the middle of the map, and IdrA is in that terrible position as Zerg where you're getting pushed and you lost all your overlords, and when you desperately need to churn out that last little amount of units that will help you defend, you're just stuck in an awful supply block. And nice blink micro here from Tester, is essentially the gist of blink micro is you want to attack, and then when your units start to lose all their shields, you blink them back in the back. And IdrA has lost all of his mutas here. And judging by the fact that Tester can just keep reinforcing, he has nice cannon defense at home, IdrA's pretty dead. And because this was the beginning of StarCraft 2, and observing even was at a much lower level as well as playing, we can see not a lot of production tab, unfortunately. However, we do see that Tester is 1-1, and this is actually a huge deal with Stalkers, because you can just very easily micro back, and the +1 is monumental. A lot of times you would see if people went for Blink, they of course would have to get Twilight, so they would be able to research +2, and they would. But we see Tester go for the much cheaper armor upgrade here, which is good, and we see IdrA going for a full surround with Mutiling, Baneling. Now, with just pure Stalker, it's a lot harder to try to finish off a player, and Charge was 200-200 back in the day, so that's why he hasn't gotten Charge. Even though IdrA lost all of his mutas, it looks like he's going to try to go into IdrA, which is interesting, and obviously he is tired of having to blink stuff over. He wants to be able to use non-blink Stalkers. And back in this time, all the minerals on the bases were a lot higher, all of the gases. Well, I'm not sure about I think that the gases were higher too, but all of the minerals were just much higher. So you could stay on 1 and 2 bases for a lot longer. This led to games like this where Protoss players could sort of just push Zerg endlessly off of 2 bases. And we saw this even into the later Wings of Liberty era, where these Immortal Century pushes would just sort of go on and on and on, and the Protoss player really wouldn't run out of money. And we can see a huge army for Toss here. IdrA has transitioned out of Muta and into IdrA, as he said, okay, you're going pure gateway, no Stargate, no Robo, whatever. And unfortunately, IdrA microing his mutas a little bit sloppily there, as despite the fact that they aren't actually that good for straight up 1v1 big on engagements, you always want to keep those. They're 100-100 and they do help a little bit. And unfortunately for IdrA, Tester has made a lot of cannons in his bases, so he could never really harass with his mutas like he wanted to. So we can see Tester is going to continue to try to crack IdrA, and IdrA, who is on 4 bases and actually has squeezed out a miraculous amount of drones and is trying to tech up into Hive with an infestation pit starting, he just wants to keep producing Hydras and Lings so he can live, but he also wants to churn out some drones and be in a position where he can go into his late game if he wants. Double Robo on the way for Tester, so IdrA will be in for a rude awakening, especially if a robotic support bay goes down and Colossus start to get made at the rate of 2. And this is like a nightmare for Zerg when your opponent is just sort of sitting on your face, I like to call it. Tester essentially has been at IdrA's door, right on the verge of killing him for like the past 7 minutes. And IdrA is in this weird position where he wants to make drones and sort of transition into the late game, but at a moment's notice Tester can attack, and because of Blink, Tester can always decommit. Robo support bay on the way. Love to see Tester crank out a couple of obs here to try to scout around, but I'm almost certain that Tester is leaving his robos idle so that as soon as the support bay finishes, as we see IdrA trying to scout here, he's probably going to see the double robos, and he does have vision of this blank third, so he sees the double robos, and the fact that they're idle will probably lead him to believe that there's a bay on the way, and double Colossus are going to get started up right as the bay finishes. Because in the same way that HydraLing does well against gateway forces, HydraLing just gets decimated by Colossus, and really it's only like 2 Colossus that you need. And we don't have the little worker thing there, but he definitely has a lot of workers at that natural, because his main is finally starting to run out, and we can see that IdrA's main has been exhausted. He's trying to go into Greater Spire here. Ultras back in this time were significantly worse than what they were, but it's actually not going to be Broodlords even though he's getting the Greater Spire. That's sort of a backup plan. He's going for Corruptor, which is sort of a funny thing. Back in the day, Corruptors had this jokish ability called Corrupt that nobody liked. And is he gonna suicide probes? There's no way, right? Is he just gonna A-move all these probes into IdrA? No. Okay, it was a mistake. Corrupt just did, you cast it on a unit and it would take 20% extra damage. You would almost always see this used on Colossus. There was this weird thing where Zergs would open Hydraling, and then when they saw the Colossus come out, they tried to transition to Corruptor, but Zergs were never really sure how many Colossus were going to be made. So if you made like 12 Corruptors and there were 2 Colossus, okay, you kill the Colossus fast, but now your ground army's tiny and you have a bunch of useless Corruptors. Or, you know, if you make 6 Corruptors, you don't really kill the Colossus quick enough, especially if there's more than 2. So Tester is nearly maxed here. 4 Colossus are out. He's had his army at the front door of IdrA the whole time, and he's going to attack into Spinecrawler, Hydraling, Corruptor, throw in a couple force fields to make things difficult, and IdrA is in a terrible position. The Protoss player is attacking with an extremely powerful army. We need to see the Corruptors sort of gather up and mow down the Colossus if possible, but with 4 out and all those Blink Stalkers, it'll be so difficult. And the Colossus, oh, he was trying to tech into Broodlord. And this is the problem when your opponent is right at your front door for so long, you don't really know when they're going to attack. But the Broodlords do finish. The Hydras are just getting roasted, and this is a very, very close fight, and Tester GG's. So that was an incredible game, even in today's standards, I would say. We saw constant aggression. IdrA was right on the cusp of losing everything, losing it all, going down in the series. But he just barely held. He actually had to sacrifice his mutas, and he did something that almost never ever works for Zerg, which is you have to sacrifice all your mutas, and then you're actually able to successfully transition back into Hydra. And IdrA really showed why he's known as such a good macro player, because he was pressured the entire time. The Protoss was at his front door with a mobile army that could easily avoid engagements, and he was still able to churn out just enough drones to be in a position where he would have the economy to defend. And that is really textbook Zerg. He found that razor's edge between making just enough units and just enough drones to where he would barely be able to survive but have a big economy. And then, even though Tester went for that brutal crushing double robo off of 2 bases as a follow-up push to the Blink build, IdrA was able to say, look, I know that if I just stick with Corruptors here, it's probably not going to work. So he intelligently teched into Broodlord and was able to have Broodlords come out and save the day. Notice that IdrA had his army arced completely across the middle of Scrap Station, almost on like an entire 2-screen radius, so he didn't get obliterated by the Colossus, even though he had a bunch of units that got obliterated by Colossus, and he even made some spine crawlers to support. So even in the very early days of StarCraft, where people were doing a lot of rush plays and still trying to figure the game out, doing Brood War holdover builds, IdrA displayed a lot of things that show his excellent knowledge of RTS. So let's move on to the 4th game. Here's old Sean P. and JP McDaniels. So this map is Blistering Sands. This is a very popular rush map. This is actually the map where IdrA lost to MVP in the GSL right before he beat him on Steps of War. At the beginning of that series, the casters were sort of saying, well, Steps of War is pretty much unwinnable against the best Terran player in the world, who is not only now viewed as the best Terran player in Wings of Liberty, but at the time he was literally ranked #1 on the ladder. And by the way, back in the day there was no such thing as a barcode. Everyone who played on the ladder played under their real ID. So when players would stream, as it looks like IdrA is probably going to go for Speedling Expand, whenever players would stream, you would just get a constant deluge of, oh, okay, IdrA's playing MVP, he's playing Combat X, he's playing Minigun, he's playing Destiny, he's playing Nest T, you know, depending on whether he was in Korea or America. But these games would just be captivating because it was one match after another, like, oh, wow, okay, the guy that I'm watching, the streamer, you know, whoever it was, whoever you watched back in the day, as it is Speedling Expand again, as, oh, God. So it's happening again. The Protoss player is going for a Forge build. He's trying to wall in the American hero, and unfortunately for IdrA, he's going to be playing this game at a huge disadvantage. So you might be saying, how is he at a disadvantage, even though we saw in Steps of War pretty much the exact same build? Well, IdrA can expand. Again, he's playing on a map where it's impossible for him to spread creep out in any sort of timely fashion. It'll literally take like the pool has to finish, the queen has to finish, the queen has to lay a tumor. After the queen lays a tumor, the tumor has to sit there and mature. After that, he has to place it once. After that, he probably has to place it again to get in range. At that point, before the creep can even be out there, before it's even an option to get a spine cooking, the toss player has already expanded, or his one base all-in is already hitting you in the mouth. So IdrA is at a huge disadvantage here, despite the fact that he went for early game units. Now, Blistering Sands is considered a rush map, similar to Steps of War. One of the most defining features of this map is the backdoor rocks. A lot of times what you would see is that a Protoss player would do a 4-gate or some sort of rush play, or even Terran really, and they would pressure your front door, walk around a little bit north to your backdoor rocks, or south if the Zerg were to spawn in the bottom left, pressure the rocks, the Zerg would move everything up, and oftentimes, because the main base was absolutely huge, and of course, you probably are not going to have creep in that entire main base, because at this time, like I pointed out earlier, queens were way worse. You didn't want to make a lot of queens. In modern day StarCraft, you can make a lot of queens. They're sort of this catch-all defense unit. They have 9 range against air. They have like 6 range against ground. If you have to make a bunch of queens, fine. They're great defensively. But back in this day, not only was it harder to expand, but the queen was worse. So you didn't want to be forced into making a bunch of extra queens just so you could spread creep throughout your main. And we do see a creep tumor already down for IdrA, painstakingly being pushed out to that natural, and the other creep tumor is being spawned, which, if you didn't know, back in this day, consensus opinion was, as soon as that creep tumor comes off of cooldown, you want to spread it. Now, this had a lot to do with the fact that, for the aforementioned reasons, there weren't many queens, so a lot of times what you would see is players would lay down one tumor, or even just have one creep queen, so they would just be really microing like 1 or 2 tumors and would just spread them as quickly as possible as soon as they were off cooldown. Now what you see is players can open with more queens, get a lot more queens going, and have a lot of tumors going, let the tumors mature more, and then spread like 9 or 10 tumors all at once. So IdrA has creep out to the ramp, and it looks like he's going for a Hydra bust. So after that brutal game on Steps of War, IdrA is aware of the fact that Tester is too good of a player just to die to a Baneling bust. He's not some guy on the NA ladder who's just going to miss a force field like a moron and allow his buildings to be blown down. You know what, honestly, in that last game, Tester probably could have not even, in that Steps of War game is what I'm referring to with the cannon opener, Tester could have freaking had no sentries, and because he was intelligent, scouted IdrA's response, knew it was Banelings, all he had to do was sit there and just make a hard wall in, which is what he did. Really, the Baneling bust opener only works if your Protoss opponent is sloppy and lazy and has a pylon weak spot in their wall and no sentry, because both of those things have to be true, which is part of why this double pylon wall-in maneuver was so powerful, because really it's not that hard to defeat if you're tossed, because even if you just have that one little pylon weak spot, just make a sentry. And we can see, weirdly, Tester is killing his backdoor rocks as he... okay. Oh, I know what he's doing. So he's completely hard walled in the front with no weak spot, and he's just going to sort of use this as his ramp. This is a smart play. I was a bit confused because I didn't realize it was a hard wall in at the natural. And because IdrA knows that Tester's a smart guy, not likely to lose to some sort of, last-ditch effort push across the map, he's trying to macro. And I love this play. not just because IdrA is known as a macro player, but because of the fact that Tester hasn't taken an expo yet, which is a little bit odd because IdrA has his Overlord over Tester's natural. Okay, there it is. And it looked as though Tester was going for 4-gate pressure with +1 again, but sort of said, wow, he has a remarkable amount of Hydras out. Okay, well, I'm fine to just take an expansion a little bit behind the Zerg. And IdrA's expansion just finished, and with this many Hydras, Tester's not even really behind. He's going to have an upgrade up on IdrA. He knows that IdrA's probably going to go for Hydra Ling again, and Zealots just shred Lings. But IdrA does have a nice little defensive force of Hydras. Back in this time, Hydras were incredibly slow. They didn't have a speed upgrade at all. They had a range upgrade, which pretty much got every game out of necessity because they were so slow. And Hydras off of creep were terrible. IdrA actually got into a habit where in ZVP, whenever he got his appropriate saturation, he would sort of do this thing where he would get every single Overlord that he had and just increment them and space them out on the map and build like a creep highway, so his Hydra army could attack in a reasonable amount of time. Arobo Bay has finished here for Tester. This is a good macro move. Now this is sort of building up into 2 base, but we can see that already he has the robotic support bay going. And as I've already mentioned, Hydraling was the standard, and Colossus destroy Hydraling. Fortunately for IdrA, he's also made a Roach Warren. He's getting Overlord speed to scout. He's getting Roach speed because slow Roaches are god-awful. And you might be saying, wow, VenomousStare is pretty Zerg biased. Well, back in this day, Zerg was actually really bad, and the maps were really bad for Zerg, so I've always been a guy, I call him like I see him. I'm not one of these casters who watches a 120 supply versus 60 supply fight and just screams and screams and acts like it's going to be close or that there's a chance that the 60 supply guy is going to win. And on the same side of the coin, I'm not going to sit here and say that Steps of War with no neutral depot was balanced. It wasn't. It favored Terran and Protoss. There was no sort of blockage or abuse that Zerg could do at the bases of ramps, and we can see that even though IdrA has opted for Speedling Expand every single game, he wasn't even close to being able to destroy the wall ends. First Colossus is out here for Tester, immediately starts up another one. Good macro there. He's also chrono boosting the Colossus, which is standard. And oftentimes you would see Zerg players try to take this bottom right base, which is a gold with rocks on it. I remember, in fact, Artosis, back when he was a pro gamer, played in the GSL and lost a really close EVP on this map trying to take that third. But IdrA has elected to take the one up top. Another problem with small maps is when like I said, the minerals lasted way longer. So for Toss and for Terran, staying on 1 or 2 bases wasn't as big of a deal. Of course, Zerg pretty much always wants to be a base ahead. But when you're playing on these maps, you sort of start looking around and saying, okay, where am I going to take my third? And oftentimes, there were really no good options. And there is a very, very scary Protoss army here for Tester. He's trying to get a pylon up on the top of this ledge so he can warp in right on the low ground. Remember, you could warp in 4 seconds anywhere on the map, didn't need a gateway, so it was very important to sort of scatter and hide pylons around the map. And with 2 Colossus out, this is going to be brutal for IdrA. The Colossus are way too far forward there, wow. And IdrA tries to spring forward, but lots of force fields go out, and oh my gosh. See, this is why the Ravager was invented, my friends. Even though Tester had his Colossus right at the front of his army, a few force fields just absolutely put IdrA in the meat grinder. And IdrA had a huge Roach Ravager. Wish he had Ravagers. He had Roach Hydra, and he got absolutely eviscerated by that force field. As he extended, a few force fields came out. It was in a position where IdrA was sort of like, oh, okay, I'll attack. His army's caught. Nope. One more force field came down. We can watch it again here. Okay. So notice that IdrA's money is being kept down. He's not floating any money. He's not supply blocked. Good macro. And also he was trying to drone up his third. That's another issue. When maps are so small and so congested as Zerg, there are little points in the game where Zerg is transitioning and trying to get into the next phase of their game. In Scrap Station, we saw that Tester, similar to this game, was keeping pressure on his opponent and trying to prevent him from getting into that stage. At that point, it was with Blink Stalkers. Now, there is a very similar thing occurring in this game, where IdrA wants to get his drones going on his third base, but whenever he makes the wave of drones to send out to his third, he gets himself into a power trough, which is the opposite of a power spike. And whenever your opponent is very good at being out on the map and putting pressure on you, things can get hairy. So here's what happens. IdrA is trying to saturate his third. Tester attacks with 2 Colossus. The map is so small where IdrA doesn't have time to say, oh crap, he's attacking, let's make a bunch of units. He's sort of in this position where the attack happens, it's like, oh shit, he's here already. It's like when your friend shows up 2 hours early to when you invited him and you're like in the shower. Same thing. Also, it's not just all down to maps. Tester, as a player, was intelligent and did a good job of being out on the map and pressuring, but let's be clear here, Tester's not making observers. He's not seeing like, oh, he's making drones, now's my chance. He makes a robo and he'll make the auto mortal, and then he pretty much goes straight into Colossus afterwards. He's not even really scouting. He's not even really harassing with the warp prism. So right here, IdrA's in a position where he saw the Colossus at the front. He attacks, he does some damage, and the force fields, they're not perfect. They don't really cut the army in half or anything. But as IdrA sees, okay, I can't run off of creep, even though I've spread creep up to my third base, I don't have enough creep to chase him, so I'll retreat. And I have roach speed already, I'm on creep. And Tester's going to throw up one force field here, and watch how much of IdrA's army gets eviscerated. So right now, IdrA's in a position where this part of his army isn't in range of anything but a few zealots and can't attack anything. Nor is this top part. But a significant portion of it can't really fight because it's been trapped by force fields, and it's going to get zealot meat grindered and attacked by the main portion of the army, specifically the Colossus. So IdrA springs forward to try to protect his remaining army, but this is why force fields were so strong, especially on congested maps without the Ravager. This was why the Ravager really changed ZVP specifically and made it way, way harder for Protoss players. Protoss in this time was very strong, and with a few well-placed force fields could just eviscerate Zerg. It is so much harder to play Protoss in Legacy of the Void and takes so much more skill than it did back in this day. And a lot of bitching that you see about Protoss, even to this day, is based off of this era and like the subsequent year after this era. Honestly, in Legacy of the Void, Protoss is pretty goddamn balanced. As Protoss, there are so many more things that you have to do. As far as I'm skipping to the 5th and final game. This is a best of 5. And another reason why maps were hard for Zerg, no neutral depot, you could spawn in any position on 4-player maps. So IdrA's in the bottom left here. Hypothetically, his opponent could spawn in the top right, meaning that the terrain was extremely unfavorable, and the rush distance was even shorter than that of Steps of War, meaning that this map, Metalopolis, which is generally considered pretty damn balanced for the early days of StarCraft 2, could turn into a Zerg nightmare. This meant that sometimes in tournaments, you would go to the deciding game where you would have two extremely talented, evenly matched players like what we see in this game, and it would be like, oh, they spawned close by ground position. Zerg is screwed. Like, that actually happened to IdrA in GSL. I know I alluded to his series versus MVP earlier. Same series. And if you wonder why I'm referencing this so much, MVP was the best player in the entirety of Wings of Liberty, pretty much unquestioned. MC and Stefano are both very good as well. However, MVP, in terms of playing best of fives, no one touched him. He was an absolute legend. He could micro, he could macro, he could mech, he could bio. He was so freaking good. And in the first game, on Blistering Sands, IdrA lost to a very sharp tank push, just barely lost. And then on Steps of War, which is a game I've casted for my Venomous Classic series, link will be in the description along with this game VOD. IdrA won on Steps of War against the best Terran ever in Wings of Liberty on the most Terran favored map ever in Wings of Liberty, which of course is why I casted it for Venomous Classic. It was a freaking great game. However, I would like to point out that they had to play on Metalopolis for the final game of the series, and they spawn in close positions. And IdrA got the crap all end out of him and lost in a very heartbreaking fashion. And I sort of wish we could go back in time and say, what were to happen if IdrA and MVP had played that game in either these positions that we see on this map, or, quite frankly, just cross positions, which is pretty much considered to be the best for Zerg. And actually, I don't think I ever casted that IdrA versus MVP game for Venomous Classic. I just actually put it in a montage. Yeah, I don't think I cast it. Oh well, rip. So back into this game, we see that they are close by air, which you might be thinking like, oh, so is he going to open Void Ray? Probably not. But we can see that Tester is going for his 2-gate opener again, and he's taking his double gas. And this is very tricky to defend as Zerg because your speedling is not really going to be finished by the time that this pressure hits you. So IdrA has been doing the intelligent thing of, once he makes the appropriate amount of Zerglings, instead of being cornered into a position where, oh, now I have to fight everything one-on-one at my natural, he will run and try to catch reinforcements. He will run and try to cut off units that are coming to reinforce the army, which is what I just said. Big fight coming here as the speedling just finishes. IdrA tries to run the queen away. It's so low. If you lose that queen, it's absolutely soul crushing. You really have to have the injects. Beautiful micro from the macro machine as he holds off that push. If he had lost that queen, that would have been so bad. And what I meant to say before I repeated myself like a dunce is, not only does he try to stop reinforcements, but sometimes he'll try to run in and kill probes, which is what we saw on the beginning game on Lost Temple. So after the brutal opening, the crushing 2-gate, which, despite the fact that IdrA has actually held off the 2-gate in every single one of these games, this was a very powerful pressure build that could really catch Zergs off guard and could really do some damage early. Now, the 2-gate was a build that would work way better whenever you got someone caught off guard, like I just said, or whenever you were playing someone who wasn't as diligent or crisp as IdrA, because it's sort of one of these builds where if you get supply blocked a little bit, or your speedling's a little bit late, or you screw up and make a couple extra drones, it just snowballs out of control, and the 6 zealots that IdrA held off, suddenly it turns into, I lost all my lings, my queen, and there's 3 zealots left. And now I'm dead, because he's still making units at home. He could have an expansion, he could have tech, and I'm in a position where I lost some drones. So IdrA has done a phenomenal job of not only scouting the 2-gate, but defending against it. We can recollect that the 2 games that he's lost have been to the base of the ramp cannon rush openers that were rendered obsolete by neutral rocks. IdrA's also started to spread creep, which is very important, especially on this map. And then expansion has come down for our Protoss player Tester, so it's not going to be a 1-base 4-gate with +1, but with Zealots and Sentries, he will probably try to move out and pressure here. Evo chamber coming out for IdrA, as well as a Hydra Den. Overlord does go down. See, this is one of the most powerful things about walking out and pressuring, is not only did he get an Overlord, which of course is just nice because it can force a supply block, but he probably scared IdrA a little bit there. IdrA made a couple more lings, and even though he knows that Tester likes to walk out on the map and sort of do these little feigned pressures, it's still sort of scary. And the fact that Tester has a natural and IdrA scouted it really was the difference between that move being a huge success for Tester in the sense that IdrA made a bunch of attacking units that were useless and then was basically behind economically, and doing what he did, which was squeezing out a modest 2 lings and sort of saying, well, there's no way that you're going to just attack off of your 4 gates when you just expanded. That wouldn't really make any sense. And he elected to take a 3rd. +1 is on the way for IdrA, and it's pretty much the same unit composition here for Tester, as he favors this +1 Zealot Sentry combo. Now this is incredibly powerful, not just because of the lack of Ravagers, but because +1 Zealots just chew through lings, and if you know your opponent's going Hydra Ling, it's a really good idea to open with a lot of +1 Zealots. These couple spine crawlers being put at the front of IdrA's base where he has nicely spread some creep out. This is great. Oh my gosh, and we see lings coming in here. Fortunately for Tester, he's got 4-second warp in everywhere. He had a lot of stuff in his main with stalkers, and he doesn't really lose all that much because he microed his probes nicely. But you can see that IdrA doesn't just want to sit back on his laurels and wait. If he makes lings, he's out of the map using them. He's cutting off reinforcements. He's trying to run in and kill probes. This is the sort of thing that you should do as Zerg. This is the sort of thing that you want to do if you're forced into making Zerglings. You don't want to be in a position where you make non-drones and then just sit there. And that's what Tester was trying to force IdrA to do earlier. Do you remember whenever he pushed out with the sentries? Yeah, well, the fact of the matter is that, quite frankly, IdrA knew that he was full of it. Tester's been doing this every single game, and it wasn't fooling IdrA, not that time. +1 melee is being researched. And there is no production tab, which makes this remarkably difficult to cast, especially considering the fact that it's from a very old VOD. The metagame was completely different, and it's pretty much hard to predict what the hell people are going to do anyway. Granted, these are 2 top-level players, and of course it is, okay, nice. He's going into robotics, but he's actually getting an OBS this time, and it looks like it's queued up to go across the map, which is intelligent and nice to see. A lot of times, players, especially North American players at this time, would just go straight into like an Immortal and then a Colossus. I think this is really foolish and suboptimal. I think you gotta at least get 2 observers. Like I was saying earlier, the game was way harder to predict, like looking back in the day, because people were just doing such random nonsense. But both of these guys actually have a pretty damn good grasp of what they're doing, and they have a very good grasp of RTS in general. IdrA has already teched his way up to Hive. He has been poking around with that Ling army across the map, and he is pretty much able to deduce that, okay, Tester's trying to take a 3rd, so I can be safe. This has been the game with the least amount of pressure on IdrA. After he held off that initial scary little 2-gate push, Tester has sort of been in a position where he's trying to macro and IdrA knows it, and those are the situations that IdrA loves to be in. IdrA doesn't like to play against people who do random attacks or all-ins or cheeses. I'm sure when IdrA was scouting around and seeing, oh sweet, he took his natural, great, I'm not going to have to hold a freaking 4-gate with +1 again. Even though he held it successfully in the first game. IdrA does have Ultra Tech out. He is almost maxed. So I'm going to venture to guess that these scouting lings are really hoping they find a freaking third, because if they find a third, he cancels it, probably loses the lings after shaving off some of Tester's army. Ooh, speaking of shaving off Tester's army, gets an immortal there. That's really big. Immortals, of course, pack a huge punch. And since IdrA wants to tech into ultras anyway... Oh, we got the Robo Bay! Holy crap, that's so big. So IdrA kills the Robo Bay too. That means no Colossus. Now this is one of those weird things where, of course, you always want to snipe off important tech. But since IdrA is going for ultras, or at least has ultra tech, he's probably more worried about immortals than he is Colossus. Now ultras take forever and a day to make, so I'm interested to see how many IdrA will have before the push arrives. Remember, there were no lurkers back in this day, so he can't just make lurkers and defend. He does have a few ultras out, and it looks as though he has +2/+2 for his ultras. And a big push is going to occur here for Tester. But with ultras out, IdrA might be able to hold this. No chitinous plating though for the ultras, as they actually have +1 attack, not +2, I misspoke. And the Colossus are doing a decent amount of damage, but ultras crush force fields. They're massive units, and with no Ravagers, this was sort of the answer for Zerg, because if you were going to get abused by force fields so long throughout the game, once you got up to Ultra, a lot of times Protoss players would still have a very sentry-heavy composition, and would be relying on sentries. And unfortunately for Tester, who has set up 3 pylons around the gold, IdrA has successfully teched up into Ultra. He has sort of missed his window, and IdrA intelligently is taking a 4th and a 5th. Now I want to point out that Tester is not some shitter player, and when I say he missed his window, it wasn't even a mistake on his part. IdrA knew that his power trough, where he would be teching up into ultras and producing them and upgrading them, was coming up, as IdrA has a huge supply lead. So IdrA ran all those lings across the map, and even though he didn't find a third, he sniped an immortal, he sniped the Robo Bay, and most importantly, he killed the momentum of Tester and stifled the push. So that's the series. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe if you are happy to see these vids again. If you're concerned that I was Zerg biased, I challenge you to play against your buddy on Steps of War who's equal skill level as you. You play Zerg, he plays Terran, and tell him to do the double bunker block at the bottom of the ramp and see if you can hold it. Oh, and make sure you put it on Wings of Liberty mode so you can't use Ravagers. Cheers.